Okay. All right, now it's working. All right, the bell rang, so we're going to go ahead and get started tonight. Before we get started, as we like to do, we're going to go through our memory verse. So we are in 1 Kings 18 and 37 for this month. So if we will, recite it along with me, please. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so that these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Okay, so last week we were looking at the beginning of the land settlements. So the people, Joshua has been leading the people throughout the conquest for the last several chapters, and now God has told him we're gonna stop. It's been a 7-year journey up to this point. We're gonna pause. We're not done with the conquest, but we're gonna stop and distribute the tribes and allow them to start pushing out the remaining inhabitants as individuals. So we looked at a couple of key points, and we're going to talk about this again. The same points apply that we talked about last week, with a reminder that these placements on our modern maps are really just estimates. The places are not very clear by our understanding of the land today. Border markers aren't there anymore in some cases. Trees, rocks, things like that move around over centuries and millennia, and so some of those things are not there anymore. Sometimes it refers to cities. We just don't know where they are. There's been a lot of destruction of cities over the centuries, a lot of resettlement on top of those places, a lot of war, a lot of difficulty, and some of those places are just frankly not there, or we have yet to have found them. And so these are estimations. This is going to be particularly important to remember that tonight as we talk about some of these places. We are going to start by looking at Joshua 18, and we're going to read the first few verses of Joshua 18. Joshua 18, beginning in verse 1. Now the whole congregation of the children of Israel assembled together at Shiloh, and set up the tabernacle of meeting there, and the land was subdued before them. But there remained among the children of Israel 7 tribes, which had not yet received their inheritance. Then Joshua said to the children of Israel, How long will you neglect to go and possess the land which the Lord God of your fathers has given you? Pick out from among you 3 men for each tribe, and I will send them. They shall rise and go throughout the land, survey it according to their inheritance, and come back to me. And they shall divide it into 7 parts. Judah shall remain in their territory on the south, and the house of Joseph shall remain in their territories on the north. You shall therefore survey the land in 7 parts, and bring the survey here to me, that I may cast lots for you here before the Lord our God. But the Levites have no part among you, for the priesthood of the Lord is their inheritance. And Gad, Reuben, and half the tribe of Manasseh have received their inheritance beyond the Jordan on the east, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave them. Then the men arose to go away, and Joshua charged those who went to survey the land, saying, Go, walk through the land, survey it, and come back to me, that I may cast lots for you here before the Lord in Shiloh. So the men went, passed through the land, and wrote the survey in a book in 7 parts by cities. And they came to Joshua at the camp in Shiloh. Then Joshua cast lots for them in Shiloh before the Lord. And there Joshua divided the land of the children of Israel according to their divisions. Okay, so they've shifted no more. Do y'all remember where they were last time we talked about, where they were dividing the land prior to this? Gilgal. So they were at the camp of Gilgal, just on the east side of Jericho, and they moved further into north. Shiloh is in the highlands of Ephraim. And actually, God called this as the place where he wanted to be worshipped. We look at this in Deuteronomy 12, 1 through 15. This was a fulfillment of what Moses said was going to happen. God was choosing a place to be worshipped, and sacrifices were going to be offered there at the place of Shiloh. And so we see this shift here as to now they are becoming settled in the land. Gilgal was a temporary location for them. They're now moving into the more permanent places of occupancy. And so they move the tabernacle, and this becomes the place of worship really throughout all the days of Judges until the ark itself was carried away by the Philistines in 1 Samuel 4. So this is going to be the place for the next several decades at least, probably longer. Why was Joshua frustrated with the remaining 7 tribes?
God had given them the land, and they had failed to possess all the cities and control it.
Yes. So Joshua here is calling them, saying these remaining tribes are neglectful to take up the promise that God has given them. God's given them everything they need, but they're kind of sitting around and not really doing anything with it. They're failing in their part to take a hold of the promise that's been given to them. What are some application points we can have from this issue? Do we have an issue with this sometimes today?
Yeah, procrastination, almost like the people in Haggai. The time has not yet come, so there's different things for us to do. So we can neglect service, we can neglect making disciples, we can neglect different things.
Yeah, we all have jobs and things that we've been told to do. Sometimes we don't see a need to go out and do them. We don't feel an urgency or a rush to do them. In this case, procrastination, you highlighted specifically. God doesn't want us to be complacent. And these 7 tribes don't appear to feel a sense of urgency to go out and actually do what God has called them to do. Sometimes we can do that too. We can be slow to act upon our commands, things we're given. What else? It appears to me, at least, that there's a sense of this promise that's been taken for granted by these people. The land's theirs. That doesn't mean that they don't have things they have to do also. They needed to go and they needed to push the remaining people out. They were taking this land for granted, that it was going to be theirs. And if they failed to continue to occupy it, they were going to be pushed out in response. Sometimes we can take our salvation for granted too. The promises of God, forgetting that they come from Him, and neglecting to act upon our own responsibilities and actions in order to keep those blessings that God's given us. So what did Joshua do here? What was his response to this issue? It's a little bit different here than what he dealt with Judah and the tribes of Joseph.
He basically dispatched a survey crew from the 7 remaining tribes, 3 men each, and they were to go out and essentially map the land, the remaining land, and bring it back.
Yeah, so they were going to go out, they were going to survey it, divide it up, and bring back the recommendations. We talked about these 12 tribes last week. The ones in the green are the ones who have already settled. They have placings, and the ones that are in black are the ones that are left. So we have Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin remaining to take occupancy of their sections. And so each tribe, these 7, are sending out 3 individuals to go out, survey the land, and come back and make recommendations. It's very similar to when spies were sent out in the beginning too, in Numbers 13 and 14, right? But in this case, it's not, hey, let's go see what's there. It's, this is the land that you're taking. Figure out how you're going to divide it up and bring it back. And so they go and do that. This is the land as it was, as it is at this point. So we have Judah occupying this large portion of land in the south, Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh on the east side of the Jordan, and Manasseh here in the center of the land, and Ephraim just south of them, and this section in the center between Ephraim and Judah remaining, and then north of Manasseh, all of this section up here is still remaining to be divided up. And so that's what these 21 individuals are going to do. They're going out, they're dividing up this section of land to find how they want to, what they see as a fair distribution. And then they were going to cast lots for it before God. There's a phrase here that's listed several times in the section we read just now. Did y'all see a phrase of repetition? It's in verse 6, it's in verse 8, and it's in verse 10. Okay, so they're casting lots before the Lord. This is being done under the guidance of the Lord. This is not some method of division that Joshua has cooked up himself. This is being done completely under the guidance of God. Again, do y'all remember the problem that they had last time with the tribes of Joseph? About how they were disgruntled about their territory, this large section in the center of the land that they said wasn't enough for them. They were complaining about it. Again, that was being under the guidance of God as well. In this case, again, everything is being done before the Lord our God. This should have put an end to any discontentment or jealousy or complaining. It's not always going to be the case, but certainly this is part of God's plan here. Okay, so the first tribe that comes up, the lot first fell to who? Verse 11. Benjamin. Yep. So Benjamin is given a territory first. The surveyors come back and they said, here's how we're going to divide it up. The lots were cast and the first one went to Benjamin. Benjamin is given this small portion of land here between Ephraim and Judah. This was a small section, but it's very strategically placed between two very powerful tribes. Judah, of course, a large tribe at the south, and Ephraim to the north here. It was pretty well fertiled throughout most of this area, except for this small strip on the east side next to the Jordan River. That's where that valley came down, if you remember the hills, and then it cut down into that valley, where it was a little bit less watered, but the bulk of the land was really nice for them. Benjamin controlled two large important routes. There's the Western Highlands. The Ridge Road ran along the crest of the mountains in this territory here. And then running east to west across the river, there was this section, which was a really important fording area connecting the east tribes and the western tribes. And so they had a lot of trade running through their sections as well. There's going to be a number of cities that were key to them. Some of these pop up, Jericho being one of those, Gibeon, Jerusalem, I found really interesting, which is not one that I equate to Benjamin. I normally equate that to Judah. But in verse 28, it's mentioned as being one of those cities in the tribe of Benjamin itself, even though later it did become part of Judah in the days of David. Benjamin became known for being renowned warriors. They were really adept with the slingshot. We talked last week some, and we're going to reference this repeatedly tonight in Genesis 49. You have the blessings of Jacob. Remember, Jacob here is on his deathbed, and he brings his sons to him, and he's blessing them, and he's really prophesying about what their future holds and what their descendants are going to have pass. And so in verse 27 of Genesis 49, he's talking about Benjamin. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. Speaking to Benjamin's strength as a warrior tribe. We certainly see this come out throughout the Old Testament. Who's a famous person who came from Benjamin? Saul. Saul was a renowned warrior, as he became later not a great king, but he fought a lot of battles. He had an army that he was following. He was kind of ruthless in the way that he pursued his enemies or his perceived enemies. And so we see that coming out too, as it says in verse 27, a ravenous wolf. And so we see that come out certainly in the attitudes of Saul. So that's Benjamin there. Any questions or thoughts on Benjamin before we move forward? Okay. Chapter 19. Who's next? Simeon. What is unusual about the inheritance of Simeon? It's completely inside Judah. So, this is really a prophecy of what Jacob said in Genesis 49. And I put two of the verses here on the board. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Instruments of cruelty are in their dwelling place. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. This was a dual prophecy for both Simeon and Levi. What prompted this? Do y'all remember the story that came out from this? Yes. So if you remember, Shechem kidnapped and raped their sister Dinah, and they got revenge on them. The two of them, it seems they convinced, remember Shechem wanted to take Dinah as his wife, and they convinced them, yes, we will allow you to do this if you circumcise all the men in the city. They did that, and then Simeon and Levi went in and took them while they were in their days of pain. And so because of their cruelty, they're cursed here to not be tribes of full strength, but rather be scattered throughout the land. Levi, we talked about this last week, they were assigned the role of being the priest and the spiritual leaders, and so as punishment for their sin, for Levi's sin here, they were scattered. They were not a unified nation as a whole. Simeon received this portion here, in the center of Judah, that really, yes, it was their own territory, but what became of Simeon? They were dispersed amongst the tribes of Judah. Yes, they had their own land, but it eventually was absorbed into Judah as a whole in the days of the divided kingdom, which is certainly a fulfillment of this. They would be scattered, and this is really the first step of that. There were some cities here that were given to them. Do y'all remember why Judah specifically had to give up land here? What was the reason it was given in Joshua 19? They had too much. It was too large. And so the surveyors determined that Judah had too much territory to control for themselves. They placed Simeon within that spot. Okay. Verse 10. Who comes next? Zebulun. Zebulun. Let me get to my notes here. Zebulun was given this territory in the north above Manasseh, this little section up here. This was in the southwestern hills of what became Lower Galilee, and extended into the western Jezreel Valley. This land was pretty diverse, from hills down to really fertile expanses in the valley itself. Most of the city of Zebulun, these cities here and then a number of others, were located in the hills rather in the valley itself. Zebulun had a really hard time driving out the Canaanites, especially in the valley, and they chose instead to live amongst that Canaanite influence, unfortunately. The men of Zebulun did come to fight valiantly with Naphtali in the days of Deborah and Barak, and enjoyed that victory they had over Hazor and the other cities that Deborah was leading them against. Genesis 49. Jacob mentions Zebulun in verse 13. Zebulun shall dwell by the haven of the sea, and he shall become a haven for ships, and his border shall adjoin Sidon. Now, this is where those key points to remember that we talked about at the beginning of class are going to really come into play. Does this map have Zebulun touching any sea on that map? No. There are some maps I saw that were much older, maps from the 1800s, early 1900s, that extend Zebulun from east to west, touching the Mediterranean and touching the Sea of Galilee. Based on the information we have today, this is the best we know. Does this negate the prophecy that would come from Jacob in Genesis 49? Or does this contradict it, rather? No. We just don't have all the information today. Okay. Interestingly enough, Josephus talks about Zebulun. And in one of his book of antiquity, he writes that the tribe of Zebulun's lot included the land which lay as far as the lake of Gennesaret, that's the Sea of Galilee, and that which belongs to Carmel, and the sea. He's talking about the Mediterranean Sea. So Mount Carmel is on this little outcropping here. And so he talks about it extending as far east to west between the Sea of Galilee to the Mediterranean Sea. Historical texts also talk about the strong maritime trade they had, either on the Sea of Galilee or on the Mediterranean Sea. And so there's a lot of that leads us to believe, certainly, that this point that we have right here maybe didn't cover the entire territory of the territory as it was actually, or at some point they extend their territory. We do know in other places, and we'll talk about Dan specifically today, that these tribes shifted a little bit over the centuries and they moved around. And so Zebulun certainly could have extended out either east or west and become much more oriented to the sea. There are some standards that we have found that belong to Zebulun that have images of ships and things on them. So we know the prophecy of Jacob came true. We're just not quite sure when or how it came true, but it did come true for sure. Any questions on that? Yes?
Is it possible that some of the territory shifting could be as they overtook some more Canaanite cities?
Mm-hmm. Yes, for sure. Like I said, this shifted a little bit over time. And so as they took territory, it could have gone either way. The text I was looking at indicated it would have been more probably along the Sea of Galilee for maritime trade and things like that, but it could have gone to the Mediterranean Sea too. What we are looking at in Joshua is a point in time. It is not the whole picture. And so while it's helpful to know where these tribes have been and where they're going, not all the prophecies of Jacob are going to come true at this point in time. Yeah, excellent question. Anything else? Okay. Verse 17, who comes next? Issachar. Issachar is south of Zebulun, between Zebulun and Manasseh. Interestingly enough, the maps I saw that reference Zebulun going all the way east to west also had Issachar going all the way east to west, just south of Zebulun, which I found very interesting as well. Zebulun, Issachar had a lot of the area in the same area of Zebulun, the lower Galilee area, the Jezreel Valley. Some of the terrain was very difficult. There was a lack of water sources, especially up in the high hills for this area. And so a lot of the settlements of Issachar specifically have yet to be found. So a lot of the cities, we don't really know where some of those places were. They did contribute to one judge, Tola, and 2 kings of Israel, Baasha and Elah. That would be in 1 Kings 15 and 16. And there were some cities here that are listed. But Zebulun doesn't play a big role in the pages of the Old Testament or the New Testament either. Issachar. I think I keep saying Zebulun by mistake. There is an interesting spot here. Just south of the Sea of Galilee, there's a trade route that runs just around through this plain of Chinneroth that Issachar and Gad on the east side of the river control. And so there was a lot of trade, a lot of fording that occurred through that area. And so Zebulun had a really nice coveted spot from the standpoint of trade, not necessarily farmland, but trade. And so they became also known for their maritime success, if you read Josephus and some of the other places as well. Next came Asher. This is in chapter 19, verses 24 through 31. They had a narrow coastal plain up and down here, extending from Manasseh all the way up to the top of the land along the coast. This territory was well fertile. It's suitable for a lot of agricultural products, specifically a lot of olives. Olive orchards were located here. In Genesis 49 and verse 20, again, we keep referencing this. The prophecies of Jacob here mention specifically the bread that was going to come from them, 49 and verse 20. Bread from Asher shall be rich, and he shall yield royal dainties, speaking to his agricultural wealth, and we certainly see this playing out in this region of the territory. What became of the tribe of Asher? Do you remember what became of this section of the land in the days of Solomon? Who controlled this area, territory in the days of Solomon? Do you remember that? Tyre and Sidon were part of that. Hiram, yes. Solomon depended upon Hiram for a lot of labor, a lot of lumber to help build the temple. And so in payment for that, he ceded a large section of this land to Hiram, the king of Phoenicia. And so Asher's land became the land of the Phoenicians by virtue of trade for work, for labor, for supplies. And so Solomon gave away a large portion of this land to Hiram, the king of Tyre, for that. These are some of the cities of Asher. Tyre and Sidon were mentioned. We've talked about that. And then a number of the other places that we looked at in chapter 11 that were going up against Joshua and the Israelites with Hazor and the Amorite alliance, or the Canaanite alliance there. Okay. Any questions on these two? I know this is just a lot of talking tonight. It's a little bit drier section reading, but we'll get through some of this. Okay. Verse 32. Who's next? Naphtali. So Naphtali fills in the remainder of the north section of the land, above Zebulun and Issachar, connecting Manasseh and bridging this space between Asher and Manasseh here. This was a lot of mountainous area, very well forested. This is Upper Galilee. Mount Tabor is on the far north, on the south, on the edge of the Jezreel Valley. The Sea of Chinneroth and the Jordan River mark the eastern border. There's not really an upper border that's necessarily given here, meaning it extends all the way up to as far as north as God has given them the land. This was a relatively unsettled section of the land, and so it's a very rugged section. It had a few Canaanite cities, and these are some of them that Naphtali was going to inherit. Unfortunately, these cities really resisted Israelite battlements or sieges. They were hard to really root out. You see that in Judges 1, and so it was difficult for them. This covers a section of territory in the New Testament that became Capernaum, an area where Jesus often spent a lot of time all along the north and east side, on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus spent a lot of time in the territory of Naphtali as it was in the old days. And so this area came into play very heavily in the New Testament, but not a ton in the Old Testament. When we talk about the kings and how a lot of them, we talk about a lot of this territory in the Old Testament specifically, in the central and lower portions of the land. We are now going into verse 40 through 48. Who are we talking about here? The last tribe to receive their inheritance. Dan. So the section that's left is right here, between Judah and Manasseh, touching the sea of the sea on this side, the Mediterranean, and so they're filling in this portion here. Dan. This was a portion that was, again, well-fertile, well-watered, very fertile land, good for them to have. Unfortunately, we know that Dan did not take full advantage of the territory. What Canaanite nation was in this territory here? The Philistines. Dan butts up right to the edge of that northern edge of the Philistines here. And there's other Canaanite nations as well. If you recall on that map we had last week that talked about the land that was conquered versus the land that was still not conquered yet, the land that was not conquered is all along this coastline here. So Dan has a large section of that where there were still a number of Canaanites dwelling at this time. And Dan went out and tried to their credit, but had some difficulty really making inroads here. Verse 47 here in chapter 19, and the border of the children of Dan went beyond these, because the children of Dan went up to fight against Lishem and took it, and they struck it with the edge of the sword, took possession of it, and dwelt in it. They called Lishem Dan, after the name of Dan, their father. This is almost like a parenthetical here in this section, because it's not happening in the days of Joshua. When did this section happen? Do y'all remember this? It was in our Bible readings maybe a month ago or so. This is the days of the Judges. And so if you go to Judges 18, yep, Judges 18, 17 and 18, this is where this is occurring. The children of Dan struggled in this area, and so they left it, and they moved up to the north. Dan is located up here in the far north in the territory of Naphtali, and so they, in some ways, abandoned the land that they were given by God when their lot fell to this territory, and they moved further up north. Again, the blessings of Jacob in Genesis 49 speaks to this. Genesis 49 and verse 16. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heels, so that its rider shall fall backwards. I have waited for your salvation, O Lord. What happened in the city of Dan later on in history?
That's where Jeroboam set up one of the golden calves.
Yep. So if you remember, when they divided, Jeroboam in the north decided he didn't want his people going down into the south into Jerusalem to worship. And so he set up 2 cities to where they could worship their golden calves, and so they wouldn't have to leave the land. One would be in Bethel, down here in the south. Dan would be the city in the north. And so because these people struggled to take the territory that was allotted to them, and they moved further north and they established their city in Dan, and they actually, in these days, set up idol worship there prior to the divided kingdom, and Jeroboam later reestablished idol worship there in the days of the divided kingdom in those early days. And so it became a serpent in the way to the people of Israel, just as Jacob foresaw. Okay. Any questions on this? These are some of the cities of Dan here that he got in his territory. Any questions on the tribal settlements before we move on? Okay. Let's look at verse 49 here. When they made an end of dividing the land as an inheritance, according to their borders, the children of Israel gave an inheritance among them to Joshua, the son of Nun. According to the word of the Lord, they gave him the city which he asked for, Timnath-Serah, in the mountains of Ephraim, and he built the city and dwelt in it. These were the inheritances which Eleazar the priest, Joshua the son of Nun, and the heads of the fathers of the tribes of the children of Israel divided as inheritance by lot in Shiloh before the Lord, at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. So they made an end to dividing the country. So Joshua here is the last one to receive his specific inheritance. As an Ephraimite, he knew it was going to be in the land of Ephraim, and he received this city of Timnath-Serah, which was located here in the hills of Ephraim. It was, he dwelt there and he lived there. That's all I have written down on that one. And this is where he dwelt till the end of his days. Okay, so he was finally allowed to rest. Is this the end of the divisions or the givings? The settling of the land? No. If we go on, there's more that happens. It's my personal belief, and some of the books I was referencing and looking at also as I was looking at the division of the land, that chapter 20 and chapter 21 happen between verses 48 and 49. Because there seems to be an end of the division in verse 51, so they made an end of dividing the country. But then there's still more dividing that's happening. And so there seems to be a parenthetical here that needs to be moved back. There was a little bit more that happened. So in chapter 20 and 21, we look at the cities of refuge and the cities of the Levites here. For summary, what was the purpose of the cities of refuge?
Case of manslaughter?
Case of manslaughter. Yeah. So if you go back to Numbers 35, verse 12 specifically, these cities shall be cities of refuge for you from the avenger, that the manslayer may not die until he stands before the congregation in judgment. Were these cities that were going to be an allotment for them to get away with murder, literally? No. The person who killed, whether accidentally or intentionally, could flee to one of these cities to receive a fair trial and escape revenge by the family of the person who was killed. They were to go there when the person who was seeking revenge was to come to the city. They would sit down, they would have a court of sorts, they would figure out the truth of the matter, and then if the person was guilty of murder, they were going to be killed accordingly. If they weren't convicted of murder, what would happen to that person? Do y'all remember?
Would stay in the city until the death of the high priest, and then I think at that time they could go home.
Yes, they had to live there until the death of the high priest, and then they could get out and go on. And so Moses set up specifically in Deuteronomy 19 a number of cities that were going to be established as these cities of refuge. How many cities were established? 6. And so they are these cities here: Kadesh and Naphtali, Shechem and Ephraim, and Hebron and Judah. And so they are on the west side of the Jordan, up in the far north, one in the middle of the land, and one in the south of the land. And then on the east side, it was going to be Bezar and Reuben, Ramoth and Gad, and Golan and Manasseh. And so again, they're kind of spaced out and spread out on this land. So it would be that not all the cities were in one location. So wherever you were, you had a city that you could go to seek justice, hopefully, and salvation from if you committed manslaughter rather than murder. And so Joshua 20, verses 1 through 9, we go through the rules of the cities of refuge and kind of where these are located again. And so these are reestablished here. Joshua 21, we'll get the right book here in a minute. Joshua 21, we divide the cities of the Levites. We talked about this some last week. How did the inheritance of the Levites differ from the other tribes?
The Lord is going to be their inheritance.
Yes. So the inheritance of the Levites was going to be that they were going to be servants of God. They were going to be scattered throughout the land as a curse, as a punishment, but they had a special role within the land to be servants of the Lord. And so they would have no specific tribal dwellings in terms of land, but they were giving specific cities to dwell in with their common lands for the livestock and the property. And so they were giving specific cities, and we're going to talk about some of those cities here in a moment, where they could dwell. If you look at Numbers 35, verses 4 and 5, we're not going to read that because we're kind of running short on time, but there's some descriptions here. They're going to talk about the cities, where each city, there was going to be 1,000 cubits on each side, which was going to be common land, where they could have their livestock and their fields, where they would be able to raise their livestock and sustain themselves from that space. And so a space of about 2,000 cubits, or about 3,000 square feet around, would be where the city was at. And that did not, of course, include the dimensions of the city itself. So some of these cities we've been talking about, specifically falling within these tribal areas, are now going to be given to the Levites here in chapter 21. And so that's what we already talked about here. Remember, as sacrifices, we talked about this already, the sacrifice to the Lord was going to be their inheritance. That was going to be what was special to given to them. So they subdivided the Levites here in chapter 21, and according to the sons of Levi himself is how they divided this out. And so first, the lot fell to the Kohathites, and specifically the priestly tribe of the Kohathites. This would be the tribe of or the group that belonged to Aaron and his family. And so they were giving 13 cities in the portions of Simeon, Judah, and Benjamin. And so they are the cities in red here. All these cities belong to the Levites. Does that mean that only the Levites could live there? No. But these were cities where they specifically were called, and they could have this area and the area around the city to live and to sustain themselves. So the Kohathites, the priestly Kohathites, were listed first. Next was listed the non-priestly Kohathites. These were the groups that belonged to the children of Kohath, but were not related to Aaron. They were given 10 cities in Ephraim, Dan, and western Manasseh. And again, it's these cities in red that are listed all along this section. Some of these places you see like Shechem, Gezer, and some of these places we've talked about before. Some of these places, again, Hebron specifically, this is a city of refuge. So these cities of refuge are going to fall under the jurisdiction of the Levites as well. So these are the non-priestly Kohathites. Next came the children of the Gershonites, or the children of Gershon. If it clicks forward. Okay, so these cities, 12 cities, were given from 13 cities were given from Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and eastern Manasseh. So again, these red cities that skirt the north of the land on both sides here. And again, we see Golan, which was a city of refuge here, Kadesh, which was a city of refuge, and a number of other places as well. Finally, it goes to the Meradites. This is behind. That's the problem. Okay, and so you see these red cities here, some of them up here in the tribe of Zebulun, but also Gad and Reuben here on the other side. 12 cities in total, including Bezer, which is a city of refuge, and Ramoth Gilead, which is a city of refuge. And so God here is dividing up and distributing and scattering the Levites just as Jacob foretold. Okay, but he's also allowing them to serve the people spread out throughout the nation as a whole. Okay, so now all the land has been distributed. Is it under total control of the Israelites at this point? No, there's still Canaanites there. Does that mean that God did not give all the land to the people at this time? No, it does not. Not a single word of the Lord failed. We have seen this phrase listed several times throughout here. Everything has come to pass exactly as he said it would. But there are still things that have to be done. Yes, the land has rest from war, but the battle's not over. This now falls no longer on the shoulders of Jacob. Nope, falls on the shoulders of Joshua, but on each tribal leader to lead his tribe to continue to push out the occupants from his individual tribal borders. So the people here have to have a mind shift of following an individual leader. Now they're following their tribal leaders as they try to continue to do the conquest. Were they successful in that? As a whole. Sometimes, but not always. And we see a real struggle point here. But that does not negate the promise that God gave them here, that it was going to come to pass. We need to be sure that when we are following after the promises of God, that we are holding fast and we don't get confused by false hope. The people were settled into the land, but that didn't mean the battle over, but they became complacent, thinking that they controlled everything, and trouble popped up. We need to be sure that we are focused on the promises and also focus our energy in continuing to do what God has us to do and not throw away our promises because we are being, because we have a perception of peace that's around us. Any thoughts or comments before we wrap up tonight? Okay. Next week we'll get into Joshua 22, which is really one long narrative. And then we will have a break for VBS. And then we'll come back for one last week when we look at Joshua 23 and 24. Thank you all.